All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the podcast Natural Awakening, where I invite generally cool and interesting people to have discussions about the things that I think matter most: philosophy, consciousness, space and time, fun stuff like that. And my two eminent guests today are Roger and Andres. So maybe, Roger, you can introduce yourself, returning guest, for those who
Yeah,
may not know.
yeah. Well, I've already been on this podcast, so keep it brief. My name's Roger Thisdell. I'm, let's say, an advanced meditator, and as a result of lots and lots of meditation, I've wound up with a mind that's ever presently centerless and has really high well-being, incredible reduction of suffering. Those are kind of my interesting claims. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add to me, or there I am.
There you are. All right, Andres.
Yeah, one of the members of the Qualia Research Institute, and yeah, have been talking with Winston and Roger for I guess like something like half a year or a bit more, and been really enjoying kind of like their phenomenological accounts of things that to some extent have been kind of like part of our theory at the institute, and yeah, very excited to kind of like try to develop a vocabulary and a way of talking about these exotic experiences in a way that actually is illuminating. I mean, like the kind of the bar that I try to reach at the very least is to say something that is novel, meaningful, and non-trivial. And in this case, yeah, we're going to talk about, I guess, the experience of time, the phenomenology of time, and hopefully we can actually, say things that are conceptually clarifying and may, open up to even, perhaps empirically testable predictions. So yeah, excited to dive in.
Great. That's the intention anyway, to at least shed some light on our confusion. Maybe not, eliminate it completely, but to be clear about what's unclear. So to begin with, I think it'll be useful if we could set some kind of, to let people know the structure we're working within. So I'm going to invite Andres to, kind of take us into the world we're operating within. Maybe you could say something about indirect realism to start off, just a sketch.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, as a matter of introduction, I think that differences in philosophical background assumptions are kind of like inevitably, they inevitably sneak into conversations and dialogues and debates, and like to a large extent, people don't realize oftentimes like the ways in which their philosophical background assumptions may actually differ. And yeah, like that actually sets you in very different paths, and oftentimes it's impossible to actually come to an agreement because of like implicit differences. So one of the things that we value at QRI quite a lot is to actually make really explicit kind of like all of our philosophical background assumptions to the extent that it's possible. And so, yeah, like the conversation we're going to have today hopefully can be actually grounded on kind of like a shared set of background assumptions that, of course, yeah, we can refine or we can explore alternatives, but at least to have kind of as a basis for dialogue. And one of the key ones that you're alluding to, it's yeah, this distinction between direct and indirect realism about perception. And I mean, to be clear, there's really kind of like a spectrum of possibilities here, but just talking about kind of like the two extremes, you have, on the one hand, what's kind of often described as naive realism or common sense realism, is this idea that you can actually perceive the world directly. The reason why you see the world around you when you open your eyes is, because it's there. And if you look at kind of like old time illustrations about how vision works, even all the way up to, the 1500s, you will kind of like see these tentacles going out of your eyes, kind of like sensing the world and kind of like, bringing back the sense impressions or something like that. So, and of course, like phenomenologically, and we will come back to this, there's really this sense, for most people of kind of like reaching out into the world when you open your eyes and kind of like sensing it in one way or another. Now, all of these within our paradigm would be explained in terms of the dynamics of your inner world simulation. And this is, as opposed to direct realism about perception, we believe in indirect realism, which is this idea that, hey, you actually never perceive the world directly. All you ever perceive is a internal world simulation that your nervous system is creating, kind of like crafting for you to, in some sense, like mistake for the real deal, mistake for reality, because that's, yeah, kind of like an adaptive illusion. In some sense, actually, yeah, like mistaking it for reality, it's evolutionarily beneficial because you don't have to kind of like spend one extra, second of processing to wonder like, okay, how does this match the real world? And like, is there kind of like anything that I might need to compensate for? You just kind of like assume it's correct. And yeah, so go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, I might just jump in. I've got an incomplete thought here that I'll just kind of put it and see how it bounces off people. But I'm thinking you could kind of construe the awakening process as the degree to which you don't experientially buy into indirect realism. So a lot of what happens on this process is, okay, yeah, you begin with naive realism, you think you're actually perceiving the world, and then you might come to see, oh no, all of these are impressions in my consciousness. But then you're still thinking as if there's like an arena, the space, which is sort of objectively real, that holds all that fake world simulatory hologram stuff. We have to realize, no, even that arena, that space is part of the model, it's part of the simulation. And this will include for the time in which it takes place, but also that there is a being that's knowing all what is in the world simulation. And you realize, no, they're all models, So
Yeah, no, that's great. I think like for the purpose of this conversation, for sure, like that's going to be something to focus in, which is that exactly to a large extent people might actually agree with some aspects of indirect realism. They might say something like, yes, for sure, like the colors that I see are not out there. Like colors are not frequencies of light. There's some kind of manifestation in my experience or some aspect of the palette of the world simulation. But time is different. Like time is something that you can kind of like perceive directly and inhabit and be, and like you can't conceptualize of a world without time or something like that. But yes, we will talk about the experience of time is actually also just a parameter of the world simulation, and it may be a very deep parameter, kind of like really basic in a way, but it is, yeah, kind of like another another facet of the illusion in a way. Yeah, go ahead. Go.
I'm going to jump in to say that what we're going to be talking about today is phenomenal time. So carrying on from this indirect realist theme, there's a distinction to be drawn between phenomenal time, which, like we've already said, is kind of the time we experience, the time that is part and parcel of the world simulation that you are currently inhabiting and seem to be located within at this moment. There are objects and a subject, maybe multiple if you're in a conversation, unfolding in time or as an evolution of time. So we're talking about that sort of time, not the time that's measured with cesium atoms. Is that checks out?
Yeah.
All right. Finally, maybe you could introduce the notion of qualia formalism. So what is that?
Yeah, so that's there's a lot of concepts that we explore at QRI. I would say qualia formalism is one of the concepts that we are in a sense kind of like married to, like things that okay, like if this is not true, then probably a lot of the work that we're doing is ultimately nonsense. If it is true, we're probably actually hopefully contributing to the science of consciousness. So it's, yes, kind of like the super core assumption, and it really kind of like sets apart different theories of consciousness from each other. So qualia formalism postulates that every moment of experience corresponds to a mathematical object, such that the mathematical features of that object are isomorphic to the phenomenology of the experience. So this kind of like describes consciousness in the same way as we might currently describe electromagnetism, that people used to think of, there's lightning and there's magnets and electricity, and a compass and all sorts of diverse phenomena that intuitively might feel somewhat connected. But back in the day, they might have thought of like, well, no, actually, there's like different substances that account for all of these different phenomena. But then it turned out that there were actually, Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism and the four key equations actually account for the behavior of all of that disparate phenomena. So likewise, in the context of consciousness, qualia formalism would say that consciousness will look more like electromagnetism than something like the essence of life, which, as far as we know, it's not actually is not a particular substance. It's kind of like more of an emergent effect of complexity on many ways. And so qualia formalism really kind of like makes each moment of experience an extremely precise thing. So there's kind of like almost kind of like a fad in philosophy of mind to think of consciousness as something that is very fuzzy, that there is no ground truth to like, okay, what are you experiencing right now? If you read kind of like people like Daniel Dennett, Keith Richards, there's actually a bunch of people kind of like thinking in this way, which is that for there's really no such thing as kind of like a moment of experience in a concrete way, because there's really just a lot of information flow, and from a certain point of view, this is the experience. From a different point of view, this is the experience. Or maybe different parts of the brain may have kind of like different accounts of like what is the experience that is ongoing. And so they might say like, okay, there's actually no ground truth about it. But with qualia formalism, you actually make the very, very bold claim that no, there is an absolutely precise and objective experience that you're having that is, as much of the natural world as, for example, the rest mass of the electron. Like the rest mass of the electron is a very, very precise number, and is something you can measure in a lab, and it's ultimately a facet of the universe. Likewise, whether you're suffering or whether you're happy, and to what extent, it is going to be something like that, some objective physical feature of the universe with precise mathematical properties. So yeah, that's a qualia formalism in a nutshell.
And what a nutshell it is. So each instant of experience, the space-time slice that makes up this organism coupled with the environment has a concrete topological structure that makes the experience as it appears, phenomenologically. Is that a decent way of saying it?
Yeah. I mean, I think like another key background assumption is discrete moments of experience and slash kind of mirological nihilism for consciousness. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of important for a conversation where a lot of people think of consciousness as kind of a stream, kind of like, okay, you have like maybe the brain, and maybe the brain is generating consciousness, and the metaphor of like a river or something like that. It's kind of like this constant, wellspring of experience. And from that perspective, there's really kind of like no objective way in which you can say like that you had like a moment of experience, because like the experience is actually connected over time. It has like kind of this temporal extension. And I think this is also kind of like a fairly common way of thinking about it in neuroscience. Like in neuroscience, oftentimes they will say something like, well, activity in the brain that happened like 200 milliseconds ago is still contributing to your current experience. Is sort of like there is this 200 millisecond window of like information integration, and in some weird way, experience is actually kind of like smeared over in time. Is not happening exactly in the present, because it's actually the result of integrating information, and that takes time in the physical world. As we will see, hopefully, that's actually kind of like a really confused and weird way of thinking about it, that generates like actually many more paradoxes than it actually solves. What the assumption that we're going to be working on is the idea that like, no, actually, there are like discrete flashes of experience that actually sets apart each moment of experience from the other ones, and they're like objectively different. They have an objective boundary, maybe one way of kind of approaching this is to think about it kind of like in terms of the block time universe, which is like this idea that like, okay, all of time is, already there. It's kind of like similar to a spatial dimension. And if you look at it from that perspective, having like temporally extended experiences would be really, really strange, because that would mean that the experiences are kind of like actually existing as kind of like these like spaghetti in the block time universe. And in that case, you actually would simultaneously be across all of those regions of the dimension of time, meaning that you wouldn't actually experience differences from one moment to the next. So whereas if you have kind of a discrete moments of experience model, really the thing that you have to then wonder about is like, where does the feeling of the passage of time come from? If actually you're just experiencing kind of these like snapshots, these kind of like frames in a movie. Like intuitively you look at a frame and like, okay, like this is not moving. You need to kind of like integrate information over time to do so. So the Pseudo-Time Arrow, I guess like the overall kind of like idea of the phenomenology of time is that in each moment of experience, you actually are encoding within the structure of the experience also information about the past. But it doesn't mean that you're like instantly, connected to the past. It doesn't mean that you're kind of like smeared over in kind of like this, 200 millisecond window or something like that. Of course, like information from 200 milliseconds ago does feature in your current moment of experience. But the way in which we would be modeling this is that that information, in some sense, yes, it took some time to be processed, but by the time it actually gets rendered, it is rendered in the present in a way, except that it's rendered in the physical present, but that information is within your world simulation rendered in the phenomenological past, which is encoded in the moment of experience. So it's something really, really tricky and weird that like, even though it feels like, okay, this just passed within this paradigm, it's actually currently passing because it's currently part of the moment of experience that you actually are. Anyway, I mentioned a bunch of things and curious about your reactions. Yeah.
So within this conception, imagine, for very, very simplicity's sake, we have like a linear extension of time. And at each point in that timeline, there's like a point instant of experience that actually at each point instant, there's kind of an encoding of the past and the future, perhaps, in like predictive action modeling, yet that is still just part of that point instant. It's not actually, smeared across that extension. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I would add that in the way we think about it at QRI, like experiences are not points. They actually might be like spatio-temporally extended objects.
Right.
It's just that they're probably pretty thin on the time dimension. I mean, they probably don't have like a like a zero extension in the time dimension, but they're probably pretty thin relative to their extension in the spatial dimensions. But if you were to kind of like zoom out in the actual universe, and be able to see how the experience is kind of like knitted or woven in the physical world, maybe one way of visualizing this is kind of like the evolution of soap bubbles. Like if you have kind of like, I guess like, if you had like a soda or like, I guess like soapy water, and like you blow with a straw in it, and you see all of these like, the evolution of a bunch of bubbles. So within this model, kind of like an experience would be like one bubble that like emerges and grows and then dissipates. But for a fraction of space-time, it is kind of this blob that arises. What the Pseudo-Time Arrow is saying is that information about previous blobs is encoded in the structure of the current blob in such a way that, yes, it represents information that in some sense already happened, and it's going to represent it in the phenomenal past within that blob. Okay, Roger.
Well, I'm just thinking this description reminds me of a Boltzmann brain, if I'm saying that right. So you just, there's a random conglomeration of atoms in the universe that for the briefest moment form the shape of a brain with a consciousness and experience that it had a whole life, and that could be you right now, but in the next moment those atoms are going to dissipate. Like that could be your experience. Is there something analogous here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That I mean, what the Pseudo-Time Arrow definitely predicts is that there's going to be ways of tricking the system into believing that it just experienced something that it actually never experienced. And yeah, that seems fine. Like I don't think that's. I mean, like it is kind of upsetting to realize that's probably possible, but I don't see why not. Of course, yeah. I mean, like I don't think we are Boltzmann brains right now for a number of arguments that are like, yeah, maybe outside the scope of the conversation, but in some fundamental sense, I think it's possible. I mean, I just think it's unlikely. But you know, in I guess like maybe the moral of the story here is that at least in some fundamental sense, it is kind of indistinguishable. Our experience is indistinguishable of that of a Boltzmann brain that like happened to be assembled this way, in the sense that like, yeah, you don't actually have a direct connection to the past, to the physical past, that you can actually, you know, probe and make sure it's actually there, like other than, you know, it's just part of your internal world simulation. It's part of your representation.
All right. I think now is the time to introduce, you know, why would you have all of these wacky thoughts about the nature of time? You know, time is just, it's here, it's unfolding, it's, you know, one moment, then two, you know, then three. What's the big deal? And maybe now we could introduce exotic experiences of phenomenal time, taking from meditative phenomenology, but psychedelics as well. And I don't know, either one of you can jump in with what comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, happy to mention about the psychedelic stuff, and maybe I'll wrap up with like something where Roger can definitely interject in. So, I mean, the first approximation, psychedelics intensify experience. They kind of like energize your experience, but they do so in a non-random way. And like, you know, a very classical effect is essentially like tracers or trails after images, where, yeah, essentially kind of any scene that you experience gets kind of replayed over and over again. And one way of conceptualizing this as well is kind of there is a, you know, the decay curve of qualia over time, over physical time, actually becomes like fatter, like everything lasts longer. And so like you have this phenomenon where essentially experience kind of like stacks on top of itself. And in that sense, in a very key way, psychedelics tend to, in some sense, like enhance or extend the pseudo-time arrow. It kind of like makes how much information you're about the past you're encoding in the present moment much more. Oh, sorry, like it's adding more information about that essentially. So, for example, like you may be hanging in a room for 10 minutes, then you go to a different room, and like, you know, for 5 minutes, you still have the feeling that you are in the previous room. Like things like that happen. Essentially, kind of like the qualia doesn't turn off. There's something that like keeps it going. So within that sort of description, you could visualize as kind of the way in which the pseudo-time arrow gets constructed makes it so that you have like an extended, like a longer pseudo-time arrow. So that's kind of like the feeling of time expansion. And here's the thing, like this is not, you know, the more superficial way of talking about the phenomenology of time, which is like, oh gosh, like it felt like an hour or something like that. Like I had so much fun that it just felt like 5 minutes or something like that. Because that's just kind of like reporting your judgment of the extension of time. Is not actually getting at the raw, you know, quality of your experience of time in the moment, which I think is like much more interesting. You know, it's almost kind of like much more crazy and bizarre that you can modify that, as opposed to just, you know, your judgments of how long did something last. But most of the studies that, you know, investigate kind of a time, the perception of time, really are like studying, you know, the judgment of time intervals, which, yeah, I don't think is like as profound of a topic as the actual feeling of, you know, time. Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, on that note, because something I wanted to ask you was how the pseudo-time arrow would play into this idea that actually we had multiple internal clocks tracking time. So I know from personal experiences, I've had an experience that in one sense, it felt like time disappeared, there was an eternity, but then after that eternity moment ended, I could recollect and think, oh, that lasted for about 3 seconds or so. So there was something was tracking time, something else wasn't tracking time. How do you fit that in?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the pseudo-time arrow, yeah, I mean, essentially interweaving together information about the past. My understanding here is that usually relies on a number of metronomes, kind of like working together to stitch together the experience. And you could imagine that there is, a good number of them. Like, let's say like there's like 20 key metronomes in your nervous system. Like maybe there's like a couple primary ones. I mean, I'm pretty convinced that the thalamocortical circuit and like, the resonant frequencies of that probably accounts for a very big chunk of your feeling of the passage of time. I don't know, maybe something like 60% or something like that, to the extent that, yeah, if you disrupt that, like a very big chunk of your phenomenal time is going to be disrupted. But there could still be like a bunch of other like, minor metronomes that are still ongoing and like are still stitching together information about the past in some key ways. While maybe center stage is not, center stage could actually be, geometrically smooth or actually lack a time arrow, a pseudo-time arrow. But yeah, I mean, the kind of like very illusory, really well made time, really well made, like, phenomenal time is going to be made with like really precisely coordinated metronomes. So if you think of kind of like a really sober perception of time, actually, I would say like if you want to kind of like take sober perception of time and like enhance that, and kind of like what is it like to have kind of like a very crisp feeling of phenomenal time in a non-distorted way, probably something like classical stimulants actually do that. Like I would say like amphetamines or something like that in reasonable doses, like will give you like a very, very solid kind of like set of metronomes to stitch time together, as opposed to, yeah, something like like LSD, which will create all sorts of exotic metronomes, and their interactions are going to be really, really, really complex and non-trivial. But yeah, I guess like what I'm driving at is that as long as you still have like some metronomes that are not disrupted, you will be like in some sense like tracking and stitching together phenomenal time to some extent, which I suppose like that actually does go away in Niroda Samapati, right? Or Niroda more generally. Okay, you guys.
So here I'd like to bring in just some paradigmatic examples from meditative phenomenology where the pseudo-time arrow, at least apparently, disappears entirely. And some of these I have personal experience of, some not so much. So in what might be called in some circles like hard jhana, or like fully absorbed jhana, like that taught by Pa Sayadaw, a Burmese meditation master, and his students, people like Stephen Snyder, Tina Rasmussen, and Beth Upton. Maybe I should say what jhana is. Jhana is a very absorbed state of concentration, a decidedly altered state, which is entered by means of concentration. And when you make the state shift into that state of absorption, the concentration again takes kind of a non-linear leap. So these are at the far end. These states I'm about to describe are at the far end of that spectrum of concentration. And in these states, the object of focus for the meditation, maybe you're familiar with, most people are familiar with forms of meditation in which the object of focus is, say, sensations of breathing. Whereas in these states of absorbed concentration, the concentration has already gotten to such an extreme that you begin to have synesthesia, synesthetic effects. So the point of access for this type of jhana is a synesthetic perception of light that has kind of merged with the sensations of breath. And then that synesthetic perception of light / breath, though it's more of a visual phenomenon, then kind of expands to overtake the entirety of the phenomenal field, such that most ordinary topology within the phenomenal field just drops away. So there isn't any kind of subject-object structuring, there isn't any kind of felt extent of time, and you're only aware of how long you had been in the state, or really any qualities of the state after having come out of it. The phenomenology of the state itself is just absorption, bliss, brightness. And these are not states that I'm terribly fluent with, but have just enough experience to say as much as I've said. And then maybe Roger can say something more about cessation.
Okay, I'll jump in then with cessation and Nirodha Samapatti, but it might be kind of interesting to talk about the other sort of more mundane beginner end as well, and how time changes there. So I like what Andrés is saying about sort of different metronomes stitching time together. That makes sense. I have only gotten Nirodha Samapatti once, and I don't know for how long it was, probably not very long. What it is a total non-experience. I mean, really, consciousness blacks out. There's nothing, no sense of time, self, space, nothing. And then you're back. And on the surface, that sounds like, well, you know, most people, well, when I go to sleep, you know, there's no experience. But, you know, my God, in comparison, when you compare sleep, deep sleep, dreamless deep sleep to Nirodha Samapatti, it makes dreamless deep sleep seem quite active in comparison. And I think perhaps what it counts for is, yeah, less of the metronomes tracking time. Because when you come out of Nirodha Samapatti, there's this, oh my God, there was nothing, like dead, gone. Whereas when you come out of sleep, there is still a sense of, yeah, I was asleep for some hours, or, you know, you kind of know it's the next day, because there's a part of you that's internally still tracking time. Nirodha Samapatti does not feel like that. One, it doesn't feel like anything while you're in it. And then when you come out of it, it's very strange. But I've only gotten it once. I'm still going to explore that. I'm planning on actually in May to do a retreat and try and get it more. We'll see what more phenomenology will bring out of that.
Yeah, to mention something quickly about these, I think one frame is not that the metronomes are not active. It might be that they are like perfectly synchronized. Like that's another like option. So to some extent, like if you think of a moment of experience as like being composed of some kind of like these like weaving together of a pattern that encodes the phenomenology of time. In some sense, like each metronome can only perceive itself through its interference with other metronomes. So it is almost kind of like, even if you're actually, you know, like rotating, even if you're actually in some sense like moving or oscillating, that may actually be perceived as like exactly nothing if there is no other metronome that is interfering with it, because you just have like no way of seeing yourself or seeing the impact of yourself or seeing the reflection of yourself in any other pattern. It's kind of like you're there might be some kind of indistinguishability potentially, and like from the phenomenology, and I mean, I'd be very curious for you to elaborate on it. Like it sounds that as you come out of Nirodha Samapatti, things begin hypersynchronized. Would that be the case?
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember. I mean, it's a very sort of foggy, airy state you come out of, and there's a sense in which it takes a long time to reboot, to kind of remember your life, remember where am I, who am I, what day is it, you know, what planet am I on? It has that sense. Yeah.
Maybe we could differentiate here for people between something that's more common for dedicated meditators, especially if they're doing, you know, Vipassana insight meditation, especially on retreat. There are so-called cessation events, or nirodha, or moments of, you know, what in Nirodha Samapatti is like an extended event. Maybe you could differentiate between the two, Roger, just so everybody's on the same page.
Yes. So a cessation is when consciousness blips out and there's no experience for, I mean, it's a fraction of a moment. Nirodha Samapatti is of the same type, but of a much longer duration in physical time. But I guess phenomenologically, I guess in both, there's no sense of time. But yeah, I mean, cessation is much easier to attain to and quite noticeable once you can begin sort of, the lead up and conditions to it. You can track when it's going to happen. And one thing I like to do is to listen to some binaural beats when I'm meditating. And with the binaural beats, there's a constant sort of buzzing sound, a constant tune. And then when the cessation happens, subjectively, there's no experience during a cessation, but there is this kind of jump cut because with this third person objective measure, the binaural beats, presumably, not a feature of my well, it's all in my mind, but the tone which otherwise would have been constant actually like becomes unconstant. You notice a little zzz, zzz, as an interesting reference there.
I'm remembering a long airplane ride I took years ago, noticing exactly what you're describing. I was listening to music, so that's what you do like frequently, to like track.
Not lately, but I have done in the past.
it's cool. It's like a third person metric. I hadn't. Yeah, very cool. I want to skip back to something Andrés was saying about synchrony. And maybe this can also lead us into discussion of like why in, say, like the full absorbed jhana would subjective phenomenal time cease, and then what does that have to do with the topology of experience, the symmetry of experience, the synchrony of experience, and then going into coming out of cessation or Nirodha Samapatti, then walking around everyday life, there can be some profound alterations to just the everyday sense of time when that subject-object structuring of the phenomenal field, when that drops out for good. And I'm going to ask Roger to speak about that and Andrés to speculate what's going on. That's a lot, but see what you can do. Oh, I was going to throw it over to Andrés, but if you want to jump in, Roger, go.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood. Yeah. So one quick note on Nirodha Samapatti, like it also, I mean, definitely from tree reports of 5-MeO DMT, like at least there's like phenomenology that seems to be somewhat shared. Of course, I think like it's probably a different phenomena, although there's like some interesting overlap. But this phrase has stuck with me, which is this feeling that as you're coming down from 5-MeO DMT, there's a threshold you cross where you remember that you're part of a realm that contains beings. Like, oh, like beings existed. Like yes, there's kind of like this remembering of like even these very very basic facts about this reality, and like wow, oh, like separation, like we're different. There's different points of view, and like okay, like all of that was completely gone from like your world simulation for a while. So yeah, and like this connects to what you asked, which is like essentially the like synchrony and absence of information, and there's kind of like several routes I could take these, but I think I'll take it through the like not to talk too much about these kind of like connected with this paradigm of attention and awareness that to some extent, like attention, you can think of it as something I've talked about recently, which is the kind of oscillatory complement of your awareness. So whenever you pay attention to something, it's not only that you're experiencing the thing you're paying attention to. There's also, in some sense, like a background within which that attention is happening. And I would claim that whenever there is kind of like a contraction of attention, there is a kind of like dual correspondent kind of expansion of awareness somewhere else. And so that kind of like explains in a way like why there's so many kind of like layers to attention, right? That you can concentrate on a dot in the center of your vision, and there really is such a thing as kind of like how concentrated you are on it, almost kind of like a physical, quantity, a physical, like measure of it. And in this model, what that would essentially be is, to what extent is the field of awareness actually coupled together and oscillating coherently together with your object of attention. So a very, very, very high level of concentration would actually involve a very big percentage of your field of awareness being in a kind of a oscillatory complementarity relationship with the object of attention, so that you're actually flipping back and forth. The thing is that you may not actually represent this, like the thing that you're actually representing is the object of your attention. But if you pay attention to the phenomenology, whenever there is a very strong object of attention, there is kind of a back and forth between it and a field of awareness that is in some sense perceiving it. I mean, of course, like that is itself a construction. It doesn't mean that, that field of awareness is literally kind of the perceiver of, the object of attention, but that is part of how the world simulation gets constructed. So if you take this to kind of like the very, very extreme, one attractor would be kind of all of the experience being kind of the oscillatory complement of like a highly, highly concentrated, contracted object of attention. But that it's not as symmetrical as you could actually get. Like that is like a very symmetrical experience relative to everyday life, but you still have this kind of like massive symmetry breaking operation, which is distinguishing within the entirety of your experience like one region that gets contracted, and like that, in a sense, that's a symmetry breaking operation that contains information. Whereas if you kind of like go to something even more symmetrical, you may talk about essentially, well, something I talk about as like exotic attention or exotic awareness, where you actually stop doing this thing where there's like a region of your experience that is oscillating with a region that is contracted with your experience, and instead you do things such as the idea of like awareness is already aware of itself. Essentially, you're trying to kind of stitch together oscillatory complements that don't actually aggregate into like regions that are contracted. And I think like at the limit of these sort of practices, what you actually have is, rather than your experience oscillating together with like a region of it, you have something much more balanced, which would be like, let's say the entire experience is strobing together. And like that still is some kind of like oscillation, but it's like an oscillation with itself. Like it itself is its own oscillatory complement, as opposed to like distinguishing a region within the experience to do so. So my guess would be that essentially, the more ecstatic, timeless states of consciousness actually are those that have kind of this exotic awareness with the absence of kind of like a contracted attention. And that will be like a very, very smooth kind of, and within our theory, like very high valence, very blissful, untroubled kind of experience.
Totally, everything you just said totally tracks with my very, very limited experience of like the jhanas that are described, in the Vishuddhi manga and elsewhere. So, thumbs up with that. Like you start with that contractive focus, oscillating between, and then eventually your concentration reaches such a point that there's kind of a merger, and then there's just the nimitta oscillating with itself in kind of a stable symmetric configuration. So yeah.
If I could jump in here, how I would have described my experience pre my last big shift was attention darting around very, very quickly. And there was this in, out, in, out, in, out. And I could notice things appearing and disappearing really quickly, but there was this kind of gestalt shift. And there's a bit of a rigidness to it, despite, I could sort of speed it up, get very concentrated, but it had some negative valence with this sort of in, out. And now my experience being much more, much smoother, there isn't this in, out, as you're describing.
Yeah. So that's I mean, it would be, yeah, it's gonna be lovely to try to like speculate actually how your how your experience is constructed within this, or with tools like this model, because I was thinking about it, and like, I mean, like I talked to Frank Yang and Daniel Ingram, and they actually said something like, fourth path for them is what comes next after perfect synchrony. That like Daniel was saying something like, yeah, like those like hyper synchronized experiences, they're great, but like fourth path is better. It's like there's something beyond that, and the intuitive model that comes with me, or like that emerges in my mind when I hear these things, is that it sounds like okay, so here's my latest speculation here. Like it sounds like fourth path, it is a level of synchrony, a level of symmetry that is higher than symmetry, because it's a level of symmetry that is higher than perfect synchrony, because perfect synchrony still has, here's the kicker, like perfect synchrony still has a symmetry breaking operation applied to it. So like even though everything could be like strobing, with in a perfectly synchronized metronome, there's still one way in which that is asymmetrical, which is that there is a phase component. And so like where in the phase you are is one way in which the symmetry is broken. So my guess, and I'm very curious what you think about this. My guess is that fourth path is overlapping essentially metronomes of all phases at once, so that at every given point in time, you actually have kind of a metronome that is waking up as well as one that is turning off. And like every stage along the way, they're kind of like, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. This is great, because how I would have described third path was becoming incredibly in sync to expansion and contraction, and noticing expansion, contraction, or form emptiness, one after the other very quickly. Fourth path is this superposition of the simultaneity of both of those. So there's one way in which I could describe my experiences. I'm noticing thousands of like appearings and disappearings, per second. But the extra added insight is to realize that expansion and contraction are part of the model, are empty as well. The degree to which you think, oh, that's that kind of movement. You can notice these, but still see, no, again, what this is something that can't be formulated, totally encapsulated with expansion and contraction. Those are part of the model.
Yeah. I mean, so expansion and contraction in this account would be kind of this paradigm of like attention and awareness and oscillatory complementarity, that as long as the attention is kind of a, if most of the contraction, so if the balance of contraction and expansion is not perfect, then one of the oscillations will be more contracted and the other will be more expanded. And in that sense, there's going to be a kind of a symmetry breaking of what corresponds to attention and what corresponds to awareness. But if you transcend that, it sounds like you would kind of like experience things in this constant kind of like stream of awareness without like attention pinch points. Yeah, I don't know. It sounds so weird. It sounds so exotic.
I want to jump in here. So what I'm hearing in what you're saying, Andres, is that like, so imagine, like, maybe we can start from the bottom up. Imagine you're Roger for a second. Difficult, but your experience is just simultaneous empty expansion contraction. At every point within, I don't know, the topology of your experience. And say for a second, I don't know, Roger, maybe you take a head injury. Let's hope not, but your mindfulness is disrupted, and then horror of horrors, like the contraction, kind of like one part of the field kind of contracts and then mistakes itself for something solid and separated out from that larger field. And I think my very speculative understanding of how the subject object structuring of experience gets kind of fixated in the first place, because I don't actually think it's something that is there from birth, is that that kind of contractive patterning of a subject, it just becomes very imprecise language, it becomes sticky. And then in most experiences for people for the rest of their lives, unless they do a lot of the kinds of practices that we've been talking about, that just kind of remains a pattern of relative contraction versus relative expansion. So the more expanded complement in your model is the outer, like the outer world or the objects of attention, whereas this more contracted thing is me over here, me. Does that track at all? Is that gibberish?
No. I'll just mention that, like, for everyday life, that would be the case. You like somebody without much meditation experience and also without much psychedelic experience might, for example, take LSD, and then for the first time in their life, all of a sudden the contractive side becomes actually localized in a place that is different than their phenomenal self. And so, like, you can have like kind of like exotic allocation of like what part actually gets the contractive side and which one gets the expansive side. But it does seem to me that to a first approximation for everyday life consciousness, for most people, it would be the case that, yeah, essentially the balance of contraction kind of like gets loaded on the sense of self, and the expansion goes to the phenomenal other, as it were.
Roger, does that kind of track with what you've experienced and the shift that has taken place?
Well, I mean, there's one way to construe things in which, you can still talk about there being gross contractions and expansions. Yeah, I can bang my head, and then there can be, swelling and inflammation, and notice, where there ordinarily wouldn't have been detecting lots of sensations, there are lots of sensations in this sense. But there's always this, so on this gross level, there can be these undulations and, expansions and contractions, but there's something which I kind of use this in a poetic language, so don't take this literally, but tuned into the cosmic micro radiation background of consciousness, this ever sort of effervescent fizz of the emptiness of all of it, that's never lost sight of.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, there's kind of simultaneously this kind of background fizz just to everything all of the time that's never lost, but within that, or kind of like layered on top of that, there is like the gross expansion and contraction that forms a sense of the body, the external world, thoughts, images, etc. That all still happens, but it's against the backdrop of that background fizz and not really separate from it. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it, there's still models that arise. There can be models of a body schema and the self with the personality, what this person sort of is into, and but they are always known to a degree to be empty. It's like never fully reifying, and then those models can also stop being projected. So again, going back to like just a sort of a typical meditation sit and tracking time, one thing that becomes evident is the models of which certain information is accessible starts reducing about, okay, what time of the day it is, what day of the week it is, as you sort of meditate, those start shutting down, and then you start entering states in which you're not aware of what day of the week it is. That information is just not, depending on how deep you are, is not readily accessible. You come out of the meditation, you can easily say, okay, it's Wednesday. But I mean, this is kind of the framework in which I'm trying to relate things to. It might not be right, but
Yeah. So something to mention here, I think would maybe be fascinating to explore, would be so within these, like, okay, attention and awareness model, essentially internal representations will have a sort of complexity score. I mean, like, there's obviously a lot of research on, okay, what is the correlation between like ease of processing and valence, that like, okay, images that are like easier to process tend to be experienced as more pleasant. At QRI we have a specific interpretation of like why that is the case. but we can, in some sense, like say that some perceptual constructs are like easier to represent than others. They're kind of like more natural or more adapted to something thermodynamically efficient within our world simulation. And if you look at that, one way of kind of like thinking of the complexity of the internal representations from first principles even is, what is the minimum number of attention fixation points that I need to construct as a framework in order to sustain that representation? And so, something like, the day of the week or something like that probably requires, like, I don't know, but like it would be like a non-trivial number of them. Like, I mean, speculating, you may require something like 5 or 6 fixation points or something like that to set up like, okay, your internal representation of the concept of a week, and then how that week corresponds to your life, and then where in the week you are or something like that. Like if you don't have that minimal set of information encoded together, you're not actually representing, what day of the week it is. So it would seem to me then that like essentially, how deep you go in this scale, this meditation scale, could in some sense like track the complexity of these internal representations, in that if you kind of like make a list of like, okay, what are the things that I can think about? What are the things that I can kind of encode? And you will see like some of them like going away before other ones. That might give you kind of like, okay, this this internal representation requires 9 points of fixed attention, and like that goes first because you don't have that anymore in that state. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes a good bit of sense. I'm wondering, because I'm aware we've already been talking for a while together. Something I'd like to get to before whenever we all need to depart is, Roger, maybe you could say something about how, if at all, your sense of everyday time, and maybe, I want to connect this to valence and why experiencing the world as you do is such an anchor for consistently high well-being. And I think time has a lot to do with it, that most people, if they're the anxious sort, like myself, or at least how I used to be, there's always this kind of pushing forward into the future and pulling backwards into the past that seems to be mostly absent for you. And why, and then, bouncing back to Andrés after Roger has said his piece, why, in terms of the symmetry theory of valence, why there seems to be, like, speaking of like representations, there seems to be less backward and forward time representation most of the time for a mind like Roger's.
Yeah. We're getting to like leaning too far into the future or pulling too far back into the past. My friend Sean called that the non-optimal selection of the temporal depth window, which it's interesting there. So one thing is, I teach English online, and sometimes I say to my students, I can tell you can just see it in their physicality that they're like reaching into the future, trying to grab the next word. And I tell them as advice, like, yo, lean back and imagine you're receiving the words. And then, they start sort of, their anxiety calms down, they start talking more fluidly, and it's quite interesting to see. So, I mean, my experience is, Andrés talked about the time-dependent qualia decay function. So on psychedelics, you get these tracers, like this build-up of experience. Perhaps my experience in which like that, those cache files are being cleared out very, very quickly. That the impressions that are left over from a past moment are less deep than they would have been, right? And so there's a sense of, time is experienced incredibly smoothly and cleanly, and there's less drag to it, I could say. One thing, so another salient part of my phenomenology is I talk about there no longer being a singly positioned epistemic agent. So there's no longer this sense that there is this one entity of which knows all parts of experience. Instead, the knowing is diffuse and spread out. And what came with this or before, when there was the singly positioned epistemic agent, that the now could be concretized, that there could be, you know, this entity of which determines the now as it was perceived as a more sort of solid, rigid structure. Then compared to with this more spread out, diffuse epistemology, it's like there's no one to speak of who or of what is the concrete now. You know, there's moments of experience, but it's not ardently declared by an entity of some sort. And I think this speaks to the increase in valence.
Yeah, this is amazing. Let me try to like go at it from one more metaphor. What I was trying to explain of like there's every phase is like simultaneously present, and like I think this connects to like what you just said. Like there's no, I forget how you said it, like epistemically privileged agent, or there's nobody who actually can claim like, okay, this is the now. So if you take like two beams of polarized light that are like orthogonally polarized relative to each other, and they're like in complementary phases where like they're just aligned perfectly right, so that like when one essentially they alternate when they actually reach the extremes, you will get this emergent state that is called circularly polarized light, where the light is essentially just like kind of like traveling in a helix. And I think like maybe that is what fourth path might be getting at, that like that like, you know, synchronization would be that you have like two polarized beams of light, but their phases are actually aligned rather than alternating, in which case like you will have kind of like this like oscillation back and forth. But like if the phases are just, you know, I think like 45 degrees away from each other, then actually it's always on, but it's just kind of like circling around. So could it be something like that? Like you always have like attention going on. It's just that in some sense it's kind of like circling. Whenever there's kind of a a sub-agent coming up online, there's the one that is coming up off online. They alternate. Yeah. Does that ring a bell? Oh, sorry, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to see a visual of that so that I could understand this sort of, you know, metaphor better.
Yeah.
Perhaps it could be. I mean, another stark feature of this is a sense that information is being registered so quickly that there's a noticing that when a point of sense data is known, it seems like it's known in such a raw fashion that there's a recognition. A lot of people talk about the here and the now. So, oh, I know something and I know it here and I know it now. And everything that I know it here and I know it now. But for me now, there's this recognition that the here and the now are added tags onto that sense data that actually are slowing down the process of knowing and is not perceiving it in a cleaner fashion. You can remove that. And there's just this sense of data being known without relation to a place or a time. That's how clean it is.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So it does seem to me, so there is this very fuzzy way of talking about consciousness when somebody says like it has kind of a holographic quality, meaning that like information can be in some sense like non-locally stored. Ultimately, I think like this is, I mean, you know, at the most fundamental level, I think something like related to valence actually. In that, like, for example, like if you have like a poorly shaped object and you make it vibrate, it's going to produce a sound that might be dissonant because its harmonic modes are, you know, next to each other and they clash and, you know, they produce beat patterns. Okay, let's say you have something like that. The sound itself contains information about the entire object. It's just kind of this interesting thing that like with something that is in some sense kind of like non-local, like the sound is like everywhere there. in some way, it's like encoding information about the spatial distribution of the object. So likewise, I think like in experience, we have like that these like attention and awareness complements. They, in some sense, encode information in a non-local way, like the region of awareness that is oscillating together with a point of attention is going to kind of like simultaneously in a non-local way encode the information of what is going in the center of attention. So it seems that like, okay, like pre-fourth path or something like that, you create these like synesthetic objects in order to tag information. It's kind of like, you know, some region of your experience becomes aware of some information, and then you create these like awareness, attention, oscillatory object in order to kind of like tag or manage that information. It's kind of like, oh yeah, this center of attention is actually responsible, is kind of the steward of this piece of information. I mean, okay, like in some kind of like exotic states of consciousness, like LSD or DMT, you can actually see these almost like, you know, playing out in a very, very real way, where like you can notice like, okay, this region of my experience, it's encoding a particular information, for example, a scene of my past or a speculation about the future. And this other region is actually encoding a different information. And if the centers of attention of those two regions synchronize, then there's going to be exchange of information between those two regions. And you kind of like create this pocket that is actually aware of both things simultaneously. So, and in some sense, yes, like we reason by creating kind of these like centers of attention that carry specific information, and then we blend them together. I think like yeah, kind of like a lot of like reasoning and logic has to do with essentially kind of the algebra of how you combine these centers of attention. But it sounds then like maybe on fourth path, the sort of experience that you're describing, Roger, you have kind of like gone to a different paradigm, or in a sense, the information is holographically encoded in the entirety of the experience at all times. You don't have kind of this fragmentation where, oh, hey, this region is the one that is like in a non-local way encoding information. It seems like it's just everywhere whenever it happens. Would that be the case?
Yeah, you say everywhere. Perhaps, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to add like everywhere feels like something subjectively, like there's a phenomenology for everywhere. No, scrap that. But other than that, yes. I think it's quite funny. We've been talking about this that subject-object split and talking about how at fourth path that's not the case. Yet meanwhile, my camera is totally doing this sort of in out. So my webcam is not fourth path yet.
I'd like to interject I'm going to put on my unified mindfulness hat for a second and try to describe what it seems like the two of you are talking about, relating it to my own experience, putting it in terms, and see if that, you know, transfers back and makes sense to hopefully both of you, to make sure that I'm on the same page that y'all are. So in my phenomenology, if attention doesn't seem like a discrete object anymore, but there's like there can be like a movement outwards. So say like the intention comes up, okay, focus on the visual field. The intention comes up again, not as like a discrete object, but actually as just more expansion contraction. And then there's like a corresponding expansion of whatever the object, quote unquote, is prioritized. And there's also a sense of like tension or tautness, like throughout the whole field. And as one thing expands, there's a corresponding contraction, and it's actually directional. So it's like, if tension moves forward, there's a contraction. And it's almost like there's this taut field just transforming with expansion and contraction at micro scales within that. But on a macro scale, that's how it feels. Like the field is transforming as attention moves, or the body moves, or perspective moves. And again, within that, there's all kinds of effervescent expansion, contraction. Roger, does that sound anything like what you're talking about?
Well, I wonder here, I know Frank Yang talks about popping the bubble of the mind, and that really rings true to me. There is this sense, you know, before there was this container space, and yeah, you could talk about, okay, tautness within that container, and perhaps noticing the micro expansions and contractions within it, but there was still this barrier to the mind space, and now those barriers or that bubble has been popped. It's no longer being represented in the mind. So it's like, even if you, I don't know, I bang my head, there's like little like pinch points within this network field, it's not contorting the whole space because there's no boundaries here. There's no hard edge that gets pulled in when the rest of it contracts at one side or something.
So I'm tracking what you're saying in real time, and I can see, and this is an edge for me, where it's like I can see that sense of boundary, behind, front, up, down, back. That boundary is actually like constructed in the moment, and it's something that can be perceived, but it's not automatic. The seeing the emptiness of that boundary all the time, that's not automatic as of yet.
Well, I would say it's one thing to notice the emptiness of that boundary. It's another thing to which the mind just stops representing that boundary altogether. So I describe my experiences. It's no longer that, there's this boundary sort of appearing and disappearing, and I'm noticing its emptiness. It's just straight out not even representing that.
Gotcha. Anymore. Yeah. So I know what you're talking about, but that is not my baseline. Things to look forward to.
Has that influenced your representation of, like, for example, the feeling of being inside a building? Like, is that impaired in any way?
No, I mean, I'm still highly functional, but there is, it's just the sense of just infinity, sort of boundlessness all the time, despite how big the room I'm in is.
But is there any way in which like that has? I mean, of course, you're like very functional and obviously very, very, very articulate and like clearly, really, embodied in this world despite like your state of consciousness. But I'm wondering, like, is there any situation where like the fact that you're not by default generating that boundary may actually be misrepresenting the situation in some way? Like, not ontologically, but like maybe you might be a little bit slower in like noticing the boundaries of the building or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I like this question. This is something I would like to investigate and research. It's like, what are the actual downsides of this? Because so far I can't find any. But let me think about that. Let me check it. If I try to do what's called tightrope walking, what slacklining or something like that, am I worse than the average person now?
And also like looking into like things like visual illusions or things like that, like it would be amazing if, like I've seen definitely some research of like, okay, like people who meditate a lot have like more precise, visual perception. So actually they don't fall for some visual illusions. I wonder if like we could find like the complementary, like, are there visual illusions that become activated on fourth path that normal people can't see? That would be,
One person asked me, do I still fall for the hollow mask illusion? You take a mask, you turn it the other way around, you still see it as convex rather than concave. And it's like, I'm not a sociopath. I still fall for that illusion. So.
Maybe illusions having to do with amodal tracking, I wonder if like the information content of the amodal component of your experience might be like lower in average, which like maybe like makes some representations actually a lot better because it's like more dynamic, you can reconstruct it faster, but maybe it also like fails to track some pieces of information that maybe in some puzzles would actually be helpful. I don't know, would be.
Hey, if you find them, send them to me and I'll tell you how I feel for them.
All right, so we covered not only temporal dimensions of enhanced valence, but also spatial. So there's you're enjoying spaciously boundless and somewhat atemporal freedom all the time. Very nice. And hopefully with qualia formalism, we can get concrete topological isomorphic structures to describe all of these things.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I'm very optimistic and like very excited in this area because I mean, even like it sounds like there's kind of like a hierarchy of like, to what extent like these changes in your experience become valence enhancing. I mean, like this idea that like, okay, yeah, like there is this threshold, removing the the outer edges of your mind. Like, yes, that has like a valence boost of I don't know, like 45 like stress dissipation units or something like that. um, but yeah, it would be good to have kind of like a list of all of the things that happened to you guys that like, hey, like actually this was like valence enhancing, and like probably all of them I would predict will involve some sense of like unbinding and some sense of defabrication and some sense of like smoothing of space and time, phenomenal space and time, or like actually just like not representing boundaries. I guess like that's the other like how big of a boundary was this, and to what extent you're not representing it anymore, and that probably generates a big shift in valence. I mean, to the extent that the energy flow within your world simulation becomes less viscous because of the absence of the boundary, then yeah, that's would be predicted to increase valence. One other thing I was going to mention is that and I know I think yeah we're probably towards the end of this, but is that one way of conceptualizing perhaps what you guys have been training is that you're tuning in to a particular wave propagation type or type of wave propagation within your nervous system that essentially is composed of waves that go through each other, essentially, as opposed to waves that collide against each other and reinforce each other. And you're kind of like tuning into like, precise wave characteristics that don't essentially give rise to these collisions. And if that is the case, then essentially the phenomenology of this would be kind of like waves of energy that go through your entire nervous system unimpeded by anything, because they're not, self-interfering and generating kind of these additional nonlinearities. And I'm curious, how much this description tracks both of your experiences.
Shinzen has talked about equanimity, which is the main, if you like, within unified mindfulness, equanimity is the main predictor of valence. Max out equanimity, whether the sensory input is pleasurable or unpleasurable. In fact, if it's terrible, if you max out equanimity, the friction, the self-interference you're describing, that tends to zero as equanimity increases. And the kind of the simultaneous expansion and contraction of space, which can be perceived, that has the flavor of waves of space mutually passing through, or I have like a felt referent for what you're describing.
Nice.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'll just say, I think, Andrés, I love the work that you're doing, and I think valence structuralism is barking up the right tree, and really tracks with my experience, and just fantastic.
Awesome. No, that's great to hear. No, I think I definitely feel like we are at the foot or the feet of a huge mountain at the beginning of a long journey of like actually grounding these things in coherent ways. And yeah, I mean, hopefully I'll advance enough in my meditation that I'll actually also know what it feels like. Not only some of the other, exotic experiences, but also, like actual...
Andrés for fourth path. Andrés. I just think about, I have this thought actually, if we could get you to fourth path, you could do the world of good, so much more than me. That just, let's get you.
Thank you. No, I think we should work as a team. So it's
all right. I think unless there are any final comments or things you'd both like to explore, maybe we can wrap things up.
There was one thing you mentioned, perhaps you want to go into this, Winston, but just the like etymology of sati and nibbana, as Andrés just mentioned, like unbinding, and sati being, instead of translated mindfulness, but remembering. But you can speak to that more than I could.
Sure. So the word from Pali or Sanskrit that is commonly translated as mindfulness is in Pali it's sati, or in Sanskrit it's smriti. And those both literally translate as recollection or remembrance. So if you read the discourses in the Pali Canon, you'll often find like the sutta on loving kindness. One should sustain this recollection. One should sustain mindfulness of loving kindness. One should sustain recollection, so remembering of loving kindness, and by that actually generate the state and recollect it continuously. So there's an interesting connection there between this remembering function, which is kind of a binding of experience, and then the goal of the Buddhist path, if you like, nibbana or nirvana, Pali Sanskrit. Thanissaru Bhikkhu has laid out quite neatly an etymological case for nibbana, sometimes translated as extinguishment, but if you look at the prefix and the suffix, you could actually trace it to ni or near. That prefix is kind of like a negative prefix, and vana is to bind. So you could literally translate nibbana or nirvana as unbinding. So we have all of these phenomenal states, which in a Buddhist understanding normally just collect, entangle, and enmesh us in a world of suffering, samsara in another word. And the Buddhist goal can be seen as progressive and sometimes sudden unbinding, or cutting through that tangle until you have a nice symmetric unbound state that is cool from the agitations of samsara. So it's not nibbana or nirvana in Buddhism is not a positive state or an object or some kind of heaven outside of space and time. It's the absence of stress. It's negative. It's a negative freedom. It's a freedom from, not a freedom to anything or of anything. It's a freedom from bondage in a quite probably literal sense, I think, as Andrés is elucidating here. You unbind your phenomenal states, and then they anneal into a harmonious, symmetrical, high valence form. And yeah, that's one way of conceiving of it anyway. So thanks.
All those BDSM meditators out there now, they're like, oh, I don't want bondage.
That's that goes into areas of tantra that I'm not qualified to speak on.
That's amazing. There was this impression I definitely once got, which is that just as well, I guess like dark night of the soul type phenomenology, like restlessness and things like that, that like there is this sense of kind of you're kicking the addiction to reality. So like there's probably some shared paths between opioid withdrawal and like dark night phenomenology, I would suspect. There's this sense on 5-MeO DMT that you experience that sensation, but for the entirety of reality as a whole. Oh yeah, so I guess like rather than just for an addiction, it's like, okay, like, yeah, need my coffee, and like kind of like this, yeah, like kind of a sticky quality to that phenomenology. But then realizing that like you're experiencing that unsticking, but for reality as a whole, including things such as the perception of time and space, and like how yeah, this sense of like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was addicted to the phenomenology of time and space, but apparently I am.
Yeah, it's we all have a really bad reality habit to kick. It's
yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Where can folks find you? Whoever wants to go first.
Right. Yeah, just find me on qualiacomputing.com and qualiaresearchinstitute.org. I also tweet, probably one of the reality habits. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter like at algecalypso with a K, or just searching my name, probably easier.
All right. And Roger?
Yeah, people could send me a message on Facebook, Roger Thisdell, and also on Discord. If you can look up my name, it's RogerThis, and then hashtag and then some numbers. I don't know. I'll tell you later. Winston can put in the description if anyone wants to message me.
And I've got a website, I've got a Twitter. I'll put the links in the description. And yeah, thanks you both for coming on.
One last thing is, of course, like if you've reached this, this point in the podcast, you're probably quite interested in this. So yeah, definitely an invitation to look up the Facebook group called Qualia Computing Networking, and answering the questions and agreeing to the rules. And I'll let you in, but you do need to answer the questions and agree to the rules. I'm not accepting everybody. So, but if you heard this podcast, most likely,
be an indirect realist.
Yes. You must pass the philosophical test. Yeah.
Well, if you've made it this far, I congratulate you. I tried at the beginning to get our terms defined, but I'm afraid at a certain point the conversation just took on its own momentum, and we may. If you've made it here, congratulations, welcome, and I suppose goodbye. Infinite bliss to you all. May you enjoy annealing and unbinding to your heart's content.
Goodbye, people.
Beautiful.
Bye.